Thank you. I'd like to request Dr. Asif Muhammad Shahan to share a few words with us to begin the session and coordinate the session from this point onwards. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and a very good morning to everyone. I'm honored to have got this opportunity, to chair this session with Professor Mushtaq Khan and Dr. Sajjad Johir. This is a great, great honor for me to have the academic stalwarts with me. The thing is, when we are talking about public service delivery or service delivery, so it has always remained a key question that how can we efficiently and effectively deliver, service to the people. And at the same time, it has remained a key question from public administration or public service scholars. It has remained a key question for the political science scholars, and also economic scholars have kind of jumped in answering these questions. The reason behind this is when we're talking about service delivery and effective service delivery, there are different dimensions, different issues that has evolved over the years. Because initially, when we think about service delivery, the idea was that government agencies or government institutions can actually do that on their own. So at that time, the focus was kind of on the 3 E's, the efficiency, economy, and effectiveness. Then there was kind of an effort to bring the other E, the 4th E within that equation, the equity perspective. And then there was actually trying sort of, some effort to make that how can we make this service delivery more efficient? So when we understand it from the perspective of governance or new public management, there is an effort to introduce market-led mechanism to make the service delivery more efficient. And then there was the issue of collaboration and cooperation, where the government is not necessarily the only actor. It will work with the CSOs, the NGOs, the private sector to deliver services. And along the way, when we talk about the service delivery over the years, specifically after 2000, there has been a large boom in terms of using e-technology, e-governance that we sometimes use, and which has essentially made the service delivery. There was an effort that, if we use digital technology, if we try to create digital dashboard and also introduce different lists, through different mechanisms that will essentially create more transparency, more accountability, and allow the citizens to have more voice within the service delivery mechanism. And we have seen that in our first session, when we are talking about that even in case of Bangladesh, there are different efforts that have been taken. There is a specific effort to introduce the TCV, to sort of reduce TCV, time, cost, and visit, so that the people can get services in an efficient manner. We have seen that in case of social service or social safety net protection, service provision, there are programs like VGD, which is now actually use the union digital centers to sort of, use or prepare a beneficiary list, which will be more transparent in nature, where the citizens can directly participate. We have also observed that the government is now using social media platforms like Facebook to sort of, connect with the citizens. So those are the things that are going on. We have seen that in case of CRVS, the government's introduction has necessarily been very effective. So there are some effective case studies. There are some innovative case studies. There are some discussion on challenges and the processes through which this have been done. But along this way, what we have sometimes missed that, it's not necessarily a managerial question. Whenever we are talking about effective and efficient service delivery, there is that issue of considering, the broader political economic scenario. Whenever we are talking about service delivery, there are the involvement of the local elected representatives. There is the involvement of, the bureaucrats who are working there. There are the involvement of the CSOs there. So how they sort of, work together? What are the power dynamics that, work within these situations? What is the politics that actually sort of, revising and in some cases reframing the service delivery questions? Even though when we're talking about service delivery through e-technologies, there is a question of, reducing information asymmetry, but how does, the power asymmetry that is there is affecting that? How is the institution are being changed and also changing the rules? So those are the key questions that we have not necessarily, answered that much or focused that much. And from this perspective, this panel is actually very timely, and it will provide some important insights to this broader questions where we look into the power, institutions, and economics, and digitalization of service delivery will essentially be analyzed from that particular framework. We have with us two very accomplished and distinguished scholars. We have with us Professor Mushtaq Khan, Professor of Economics, School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, who is going to talk about asymmetries of information, power, and digitalization outcomes, and probably talk about role of the institutions and actors and how that has actually creating an impact. We have also with us Dr. Sajjad Johir, Executive Director, Economic Research Group, and Senior Advisor at BIGD BRAC University, who is going to talk about digital transformation in a developing country, and will help us to understand, develop or understand a framework to assess challenges and opportunities to go beyond digitalizations. I know that we are waiting to listen from our distinguished panel. So without further ado, may I now request Professor Mushtaq Khan to present his paper.
Thank you. I need my PowerPoint. Thank you. So thank you, Professor Shahan, and thank you, BIGD, for inviting us to this event. I want to present a paper which is the result of quite a lot of research already in the Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Consortium. And it's based on a couple of papers I've written with my co-author, Dr. Pallavi Roy, who is in the audience. And it's an approach that we have been developing with A2I, and we intend to take this forward in research jointly with A2I and BIGD. BIGD is also a partner in ACE. So this approach really is trying to answer this question that digital service delivery has achieved quite different results in different sectors and different countries, and trying to explain why this is the case. And we argue that you can make sense of this by looking at differences in power, capabilities, and interests across society. And this triad of power, capabilities, and interests is critical in terms of understanding a lot of governance issues in developing countries. So as we heard earlier today, the issue of digitalization is aimed at addressing two separate sets of problems. One is digitalization can reduce transaction costs, which is the cost of getting the service. The number of visits, the time, the TCV that Anir talked about earlier on. It also reduces information asymmetries, that I as a citizen don't know what I'm entitled to, or I as a public official don't know if the citizen is entitled to this service or not. So there is an information asymmetry, sometimes in favor of the citizen, sometimes and more often in favor of the government official. And digitalization can reduce these information asymmetries and therefore reduce corruption. Now, interestingly, corruption in service delivery is not just driven by the public official. Corruption can also be driven by citizens of different types who use their power and connections to get access to resources that they are not entitled to. So the corruption issue is actually a much more complex issue than is usually thought of. However, to achieve these good outcomes, we have to make a number of assumptions about necessary conditions, and these assumptions usually do not hold. First of all, the underlying databases, both of who is a citizen and what they're entitled to, all these databases have to be accurate, and we know that they are not. So they're not accurate even in very advanced countries. But if they are not accurate, then we need to have very robust error correction systems. That is, I am not included in this list, how do I correct it? This process doesn't work for me, how do I correct that? This error correction process has to be accessible to all citizens and very easily. Without this error correction, actually, digitalization can increase the problems that already existed with analog systems. The third condition is the most important one and is one that we often forget. Information does not necessarily lead to enforcement, and enforcement is not necessarily equal for everyone. So this link between information and enforcement is a critical assumption, and we assume that there is something called a rule of law already there or almost close to it, that if the information is there, then action will be taken. But actually we know in many countries, you might have the information and no action is taken. So why are we assuming that if you have digital information, action will be taken when analog information doesn't result in action being taken? So there's a very big assumption that information will lead to enforcement and that the likelihood is the same regardless of the identity of the citizen. And this is what I'm going to focus on. Actually, it is not equal regardless of the identity of the system, particularly in developing countries. Now, if less powerful citizens have more difficulty in error correction, and if enforcement of their information is less likely, then actually digitalization can perversely result in a worse outcome than the analog system. And I think this is what we are observing in many countries, in many sectors, that if we are not careful, because this error correction and enforcement is adverse for the less powerful sections of society, digitalization can result in adverse outcomes. And some of the reasons why the powerful actually like digitalization is it allows them to actually control and extract more efficiently. So it's true that information is power, but we have to ask power for whom? Information is not necessarily power for the less powerful, because the less powerful might not be able to convert this information into enforcement. Okay, so that's the basic issue. And while these problems of error correction and enforcement exist everywhere, they are more acute in developing countries for a number of reasons. The first reason is that databases are less well established and have more errors in developing countries. So even to establish identity is very difficult in a developing country because births, deaths, addresses, even spellings of names are not standardized. Even birth dates are not correct. They might be off by a year or two in different documents of the same person. And the verification depends on local officials who are easily influenced by citizens. Secondly, not only is the identity database not good, other databases to which the identity is going to be linked are also not very good. So databases on tax records, land registries, welfare records, all have massive errors and inconsistencies in them. So when you link up weak identity databases with weak databases on eligibility, for example, you can get very poor outcomes. And the worst point of it is that the rule of law is also weaker. So if you are less powerful, you are less able to change things and get access to correction. So this is what we find is that because more powerful citizens can do their error correction faster, they are also able to delay enforcement if the judgment goes against them. And even worse, sometimes they can influence the creation of new records. For example, in land registry and mutation records, and this is, by the way, not theory. I've experienced this myself, that this process of e-mutation is now being driven by massive amounts of money being spent in the local land offices with the naibs and tehsildars and the AC land, because whoever gets their e-mutation in first is now much more difficult to change than it used to be in the past. So actually, the process of digitalization has given opportunities for the more powerful. If the land record itself is not clear, the person who can first get their e-mutation done by spending resources has a huge advantage in subsequent legal challenges. So now let's come back to the question we started with. What are the problems that digitalization is trying to solve? And these problems are not always just due to asymmetric information. It's usually a combination of asymmetric information. Asymmetric information means that I know something that you don't know. You're the public official. You know something about my entitlements. I don't know it. So this is one source of the problem. But a lot of problems are also because of asymmetric power. And asymmetric power is a very different problem from asymmetric information. Asymmetric power is that I will get my way even if you know that what I'm doing is wrong, that I will do it openly. You know that you are entitled to something. I know that you are entitled to something. So there is no asymmetric information problem, but you have no power to enforce. I will still not give it to you. This problem of asymmetric power is really severe in developing countries and is not solved by improving information flow on its own. Asymmetric information can be reduced without asymmetric power being reduced. And sometimes, as we will argue, reducing asymmetric information by digitalizing actually paradoxically can increase asymmetric power. And this is a really frightening outcome that might happen in some cases. And the third issue is that there are faulty processes. And Anir talked about this earlier on, that if you have a very complex analog process and you digitalize it, actually it makes problems even more difficult. So linking these things up with a digital system can reduce some information asymmetry problems, but some power asymmetries may worsen and faulty processes become more difficult to correct. So we established this by what we did was we looked at a lot of historical examples of studies done on digitalization. And a lot of this comes from India because India has been in the lead of rolling out digitalization with the Aadhaar system. And there's a lot of research now on different aspects of the Aadhaar system. So we went through all of this literature and we found that some people were saying it's working, some people are saying it's not working, some people are saying, but when you look at what is working and what is not working, there are some systematic patterns. And then we used that evidence on the systematic patterns to develop a very crude framework of analysis to make sense of why it was working in some areas and not working in other areas, and in some areas making things actually worse. So when does digitalization make things better? It makes things better when the problem is primarily one of asymmetric information. And if you have more or less a rule enforcement that if you have the information, that will lead to a correction or enforcement. When those two things happen or are in place, then digitalization results in better outcomes. And we have seen this in some applications in India, that the outcome improved because of the nature of the application. But if the enforcement is weak, because the people who are involved are not powerful, and they can't use information to enforce, then you have information not being acted upon by the principal, the bureaucrat or the politician, because they don't have the incentive or the power to act. So if the person who is supposed to use the information doesn't have the incentive or the power to act on this, then you don't have an improvement. In fact, you can make things worse. And this problem is widely recognized in the literature and is described as a problem of unprincipled principles. That the principal knows what needs to be done, but it's not an asymmetric information problem, but they still don't act. The term unprincipled principle is very unfortunate, because the reason why principals are not acting is not because they're unprincipled, that they have some moral issues. The reason why they're unprincipled is usually because they have no incentive or power to act. So you have to look at the incentives and power of the enforcer and why they're not acting. And once you do that, you see some very significant patterns. So to repeat what I said earlier, information is a source of power, but is not necessarily a source of power for those who are less powerful. Information can be a source of power for those who are more powerful. And if that is the case, then information can increase the asymmetry of power. I'm going to skip this slide. So what we are going to look at is the implication of digitalization in different types of violations. And we use this kind of framework to make sense of where digitalization is working and where it is not working in developing countries like India and Bangladesh. And then we have a framework for thinking about what we can do about that. So there are two distinctions here. One is, why are violations happening? Why is the violation, the corruption or the transaction cost happening? And this could be for two reasons. And this has to do with the interests and capabilities of the violator. Who is violating? So some of these violations are happening because the violator does not want to violate, but they have no capacity to comply with the rules. So think of a case where I am a business, I'm doing international trading. I want to follow all the regulations because my trading partners want me to be compliant. I want to be compliant. But the rules are such that I cannot be compliant. There's no way I can be compliant because the rules are contradictory. The rules are extremely difficult. I cannot comply. So this is the first row. The rules might not be feasible for me, given my capabilities and given my productive activities. I cannot comply with these rules. So the first column are where the rules are not feasible. Even if I want to comply, I cannot comply. So this is one kind of violation. So you have to understand the capabilities of the players. The second row, the second column, is where the rules are feasible. I could comply with the rules, but I decide not to comply because I can make even more money by cheating, by extracting, by not paying taxes, by not complying. The second column is a violator can comply, but is not complying. Now, this is an incredibly important distinction in developing countries because developing countries are extremely heterogeneous. There are large segments of society which are in the informal sector, which are low productivity, and they cannot comply with lots of rules, even if they want to comply. And there is a section which is very modern, which can comply, but which might choose not to comply because they're free riders or thieves. And you cannot combine these two things in one framework, because if you do, you get into serious problems. There are different kinds of actors in a developing country. Then we also distinguish between the power of these violators. Are they powerful relative to the enforcers, or are they less powerful relative to the enforcers? And those are the two roles. And with this categorization, we can distinguish between a number of quite different types of violations with very different impact of digitalization on them. So the first type is box one, where the rules are not feasible, but the violators are powerful. So think of this powerful business is exporting or importing. It wants to comply with the tax regulations. It wants to comply with the safety regulations, health regulations, but the regulations are very complex. It cannot comply. So traditionally what they would do is that they would evade these rules by paying small amounts of corruption. They would pay speed money, they would pay some regulators some money, and they would operate, okay? But these are powerful entities, they are big firms. Now, what happens when you digitalize this? When you digitalize these rules, it becomes transparent that they are violating. As soon as it becomes transparent, they don't like this because they have other transacting partners who don't want them to be violating, because international transactions particularly have to be rule compliant to be viable. So what happens here is that digitalization then forces these powerful actors to change the rules. So error correction happens. Error correction happens because they go to the government, their friends in the bureaucracy or politics, and say, these rules aren't working. The rules are then simplified, the databases are corrected, and then that kind of corruption goes down. This is a really important positive effect of digitalization, but it only works when the error correction happens. Now, this happens if the participants are powerful and have access. And this is where you have seen a lot of progress in developing countries, where particularly in India, with the Aadhaar and the unified payment system, has resulted in big improvements in doing business conditions. So you can do a lot of business in much more rapidly, for example, getting permits, setting up or liquidating companies, collecting payments. That resulted in a significant improvement in India's doing business ranking. People have some issues with the doing business ranking, but certainly doing business improved in India. Even without businesses, if powerful citizens are involved, for example, getting passports or making payments of electricity bills online, those things are rapidly streamlined because powerful citizens are involved. They will put pressure on governments to improve those things, right? So in Bangladesh, I can now pay my electricity bill using my phone, whereas previously I would have to send someone to sit for hours in the office, in the bank, and possibly spend some money just to pay the electricity bill. However, there's another really important part of violations where the things are not so rosy. This is where the violation is happening by less powerful players who cannot comply with the rules because they're largely in the informal economy. These are SMEs, these are peanut sellers sitting outside on Mohakali Road trying to sell their peanuts. They cannot comply with hundreds of rules. As soon as you try to enforce rules on these people and digitalize them by linking them up to tax systems and other benefit systems, you have serious problems emerging because first of all, they have no error correction mechanism that they can exercise pressure on the government to make the rules appropriate for them according to their capabilities. So their only option then is to exit from the market because they can no longer comply with these rules. So this process, which we call in one of our papers premature formalization or premature enforcement, is a serious problem in many developing countries where the SME sector has been very badly hit by rapid formalization, particularly of tax. India, again, has been the lead in this with the GST system that it introduced, which is now linked to the Aadhaar. And that means that any business has to operate in India, has to pay this GST, which is like a VAT tax. And to do that, it has to maintain very expensive records of invoices, both in and out. And if you don't maintain those invoices, you go bankrupt because you will have to pay the tax. And if you can't collect the tax on the tax paid by your input suppliers, you can very easily go bankrupt, right? So the big businesses love GST, but small businesses hate GST because they have no capacity to maintain the records, which will allow them to collect the tax which has already been paid. It's like a VAT. They organized against it, but they failed because they didn't have the voice of the political power. And the result was that the Indian economy as a whole took a huge hit because a lot of SMEs started struggling and many of them closed down. And it's a classic example of function creep, where something that was meant for the big players was extended to the smaller players without thinking through the effects on capabilities. This effect that SMEs are different from big companies is not just in developing countries, but even in advanced countries. So the more formalization you do, the more advanced SMEs benefit, but the struggling SMEs close down. Now, this is a important point because some economists argue that inefficient SMEs should be closed down because this is efficient. They are using resources inefficiently, and those resources should be allocated to more efficient users. That kind of argument makes some sense in an advanced economy. It is absurd in a developing country where the alternative uses of these resources don't yet exist. So if you close down these SMEs, it is not that these resources will be reallocated in better jobs or more employment elsewhere. They will just remain unemployed. So actually this argument that inefficiency is reduced by closing down these informal sector players is not a good argument in developing countries. Something happened.
Can we take care of?
Okay. Then let's go to a third case, which is where the violation is happening with powerful players who deliberately are violating, who could comply, but decide not to comply. What happens when you digitalize here? This is a really important area. And here, actually what we find, and the evidence is very difficult to collect because it is very secretive and hidden, but the evidence we have collected is that digitalization can actually have negative effects by making some of this extraction easier. Now, you can ask, how the hell does that happen? Well, I already gave you an example of the mutation process in Bangladesh. In the mutation process in Bangladesh, people who are more powerful are running to get their mutation done first because everybody's documents have some problems. Nobody has a land document in Bangladesh which has no problems. The registration documents, the ownership, the cadastral surveys, the possession, they are all inconsistent. So whoever gets in first and spends some money and does this has a huge advantage. Now, in India, again, this evidence is very strong. So if you link Aadhaar identities with blockchain in land acquisition, what you do is create massive incentives for the rich and the powerful to get in first, because once you have established your record in blockchain and Aadhaar, nobody can change it afterwards, right? So the error correction is stopped. So the stakes become very high, and people then run in to establish their ownership in disputed systems. So in the past, there were open error correction mechanisms where even the less powerful could contest you in court for years and years and get something. Now you fix it once and for all. So a form of primitive accumulation is opening up. Another very interesting example I had from a student of mine who was an IAS officer in customs. This IAS officer left the customs and is now teaching in the West. And he wrote a master's thesis which showed how when the Indian customs digitized itself, a lot of small-scale corruption went out. So the way it was digitalized is that now you have a seamless connection with the exporter and the importer, and the container is not opened anymore because the documentation is supplied by the exporter and the importer, and it just comes through. So the small corruption is no longer possible, but the really big players fix both the exporter and the importer, and then the container is not opened at all. So once you do that, digitalization allows almost anything to come in. The stakes are very high, but only a small number of players are now doing it. And these small numbers of players are connected to the highest political levels often. Therefore, the rule of law doesn't work. So even random checks don't happen on these high value imports. We also know how the ruling party in India is using access to Aadhaar systems to target voters with promises of different things according to caste, voting patterns, and occupations. So actually this data allows the powerful to stay in power for longer because they have access to data which they can use for basically manipulating elections. This is also a very well-known process in India. And the most serious implication of this is that if a government really wants to go after a target population, in Assam, for example, we have this in our paper, where 1.9 million people have been declared stateless as part of the NRC, they have to now submit their Aadhaar numbers, and they might not be eligible for any services going forward because without the Aadhaar number, you cannot get access to services in India. So it means that if the state wants to target a community, it now has a weapon which is incredibly powerful. So you can see how the asymmetry of power has increased, because in the past, people could have different sets of documents to keep on fighting. Now there is only one document and the central state controls it, right? So these are all examples where digitalization has increased the asymmetry of power and made the vulnerable much more vulnerable. I can give you more examples from both Bangladesh and India. Okay, so what that allows us to do is to look at a number of differences in types of applications, the capability and power of the violators, and make sense of what might be the likely impact of digitalization on service delivery and on inclusion or exclusion in these sectors. So the last example, sorry, this was the fourth case. The fourth case is where the rules are feasible, but the violators are not powerful. If the violators are not powerful, what you have is opportunistic fraud. So this is really violation by low-level bureaucrats. Lower-level bureaucrats collude with lower-level citizens to steal money. So the fourth example is one where actually digitalization can reduce this kind of fraud because the violators are not powerful and they're using information opportunistically. Many big examples from India where digital identities have stopped fake identities being used to get lots of subsidies from the government. Many of you will have seen these studies, which are quite famous, and so I'm not going to go into this. But even here, when you stop fraud based on identity, it's really a small part of the fraud. What digital identities do is it reduces identity fraud. You cannot have fake people claiming subsidies because that person must have an identity. So identity fraud goes down, but it doesn't stop eligibility fraud. Eligibility fraud is I have an identity, but I'm not eligible to get this subsidy because I'm not poor, for example. Now, who decides if I'm poor or not? That's not a digital, because the database is not good enough for you to identify who is poor just on the basis of their identities. Some individual, a politician or a local official, has to make that decision, and that person can still be manipulating the data so that non-eligible people are counted as poor and poor people are not counted as poor. So digitalization does not get rid of eligibility fraud, it gets rid of identity fraud. This is a really big difference. And certainly it doesn't get rid of quantity fraud. That is, I am eligible, I have an identity, I'm supposed to get 1 sack of grain, but I get half a sack of grain. So it doesn't get rid of the quantity fraud or the eligibility fraud, but it might reduce the identity fraud. Well, that's progress. So here is the issue. Of these 4 types of violations, the greenish ones are the ones where digitalization has a positive impact for different reasons, but there is a positive impact. The pink ones are the ones where digitalization may well have a negative impact, and we have lots of examples where it actually does have a negative impact. So now let's say what the policy implications are. And here is where we are working with A2I and Anir, who unfortunately had to leave, but he's a great fan of this framework because he thinks it has application in Bangladesh to make sense of what the rollout is how the rollout has to be redesigned. So what we are saying is that while there are clear benefits in some areas, the digitalization of service delivery has potential power asymmetries and adverse effects in other areas. And to prevent this, we have to consider a number of factors. Firstly, we have to understand the analog process really well. Why is the analog process not working? The analog, by analog process, I mean is a pre-digital process. How is that one working? And why is it not working? Often we try to digitalize without understanding the problems in the existing system. So for example, if you really try to understand why land registration and mutation is not working in Bangladesh, you will see the problem is not a problem of asymmetric information. It's not that the land office has information that you don't have and is making you run around. The real problem in land in Bangladesh is that people have conflicting records. My land record conflicts with your land record. My registration conflicts with yours. My possession conflicts with yours. This is not a problem of asymmetric information. So it's a problem of deep inconsistencies in the land records going back centuries, which have to be resolved. Now, if you impose digitalization on this, you are enabling the powerful to actually capture land. Whereas in the past, because of these inconsistent land records, you kept open the space for multiple points of contestation. By stopping the contestation, you're actually not doing anyone any favors, you are doing a lot of harm. So first, understand what the problem was before you try to solve it. The problem is not everywhere the same. The second is that we have to ask whether the digital system will actually reduce discretion in a feasible way or not. Will they actually exacerbate the power asymmetry or not? Will it be a system which has error correction built into it or not? So we then have to look at the digital system very carefully to make sure that it is aligned with the capabilities of those who are trying to help. The peanut seller can digitalize and still sell peanuts or have a job. The powerful cannot fix the customs delivery in such a way that actually mega corruption can happen. We have to figure all this out with careful analysis before we roll out the digital system. So therefore, we need to engage in research sector by sector, application by application, before rolling out the digital systems. I will end there and say that the really heartening thing of this is that both A2I and the minister, when we made this presentation to them, were very encouraging and saying that actually we do realize some of these problems, which I find really heartening. So the opportunity to actually work in the heart of government is what we are excited about, and we want to take this forward. I don't know how effective it will be, but at least they're open to these kinds of new ways of thinking about the problems and challenges and opportunities of digitalization. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Mushtaq Khan. I think this is very enlightening, and in terms of when we consider something that it will always solve the problems, the underlying problem that it is creating, and the extent of this problem, and whether we really need to do things the way we need to do, and to sort of consider the issues before that, to understand that's very important. And at the same time, I think the policy implications are important and significant. I'm sure that we will have a lot of discussion on that. But I am also aware of the time. So we will, of course, have discussion on this. But before that, may I now request Dr. Sajjad Johid to deliver his presentation. Thank you.
I'm trying to learn the technique first before I can get into the discussion.
Can someone help?
Do I emit this side, right? Okay. Okay, I was trying that. Sure. Thank you. See, there are two broad approaches I see. One is you want to bring about some change in doing things, which is the BPM thing, the business process management thing. So you go through the processes, change things. So you have an objective, and how you can implement that is the whole set of problems. And then you identify, from the government side, you identify issues which run into barriers, something that Mushtaq discussed fall into that category, whereas some of the private sector initiatives that have taken place have been successful, at least for now, are also into that broad BPM framework. And if I'm right, Stephen did mention at the end of his presentation that there has to be an honest understanding about the whole system, and it's not all about the digitalization is not all about digitizing and re-engineering things. It's much more than that. My presentation today will actually take a step back like an onlooker and try to figure out what is happening in this whole arena of digitalization in the name of digitalization. And if I may put my conclusion at the beginning, is unless we have a digital transformation strategy, the efforts towards digitalization, I'm not talking about digitization, which is a basic thing which ought to be addressed before you engage in digitalization. Any attempt towards digitalization will be either short-lived or will, in the best possible scenario is when you widen the consumer market, you also prepare a labor force for working in the outside world, but staying at home, which is going to be in the long run very short-lived because of the faster pace of technological changes in the developed countries. And thereby you end up falling behind, which recent reports by UNIDO, UNCTAD have revealed that actually with technological progression, the disparity between countries, between the developed countries and the less developed countries is increasing, because it's very difficult to keep pace with the technological change and then upskill yourself and your labor force. Once you accept that there is going to be displacement of that labor with technological changes. So the essence, what I'm going to do is not looking into institutions at micro level. The first proposition is when you have a plan to change things, to introduce a new product or new service, then you work out whatever. It's like the drivers of change approach, the TOC approach, or the political economy approach that many have been looking at and trying to figure out how you get rid of those hurdles and implement your design. I'm seeing Mushtaq's presentation largely in trying to understand, which fits in on its perspective of trying to reach out with government services, change, and pick up the bits and pieces, address those things. My approach is a bit at the meso level institutions. trying to understand what is actually happening in the sphere of digitalization. As I said, digital transformation strategy is a must to manage the digitalization process in a meaningful way. And that took me first is what I say is this, the 3Ds, the digitization, digitalization, and digital transformation. And I basically distinguish between the digitalization and digital transformation because current literature broadly is influenced by two groups of people, as I see it. Is the business-oriented people, and the other is the technical ones, the engineering ones. I skipped through. This is from the Sloan MIT school, which is the business process management thing. And if you look at this digitalization, innovation of business models and processes that exploit digital opportunities, and the digital transformation goes into restructuring of economies, institutions, and society that occur through digital diffusion. I will differ from this concept of digital transformation. If we look into the engineering perception, you will see that digitalization is a transformation where the digital technology is being introduced. And there is no distinction between digitalization and digital transformation as such. This is, I'm talking about the engineering perspective. This is broadly the brief summary about the engineering perspective and the adoption perspective, which you see under the business model, where procurement actually dominates. Innovation of business models and progresses that exploit digital opportunities, where from those digital technology or the devices come, no question is being asked. There is a third perspective, which I'm proposing here, creating economic value out of local ideas on an eventual production of digital technology or the, technology means a lot of things. It's not just the hardware. It can be the software part also. And that support creative engagement for skill and knowledge building. We extend the technical space of the computer science and engineering perspective to link technology space with ideas before bringing a social choices are being shaped and while local level institutions are often endogenous. What I'm suggesting is the choice between creating and procuring is actually one done by institutions. And that's where the incentives, the whole incentive issues, the behavioral issues can come in explaining the meso-level institutions' behavior. And that's the whole exercise of this one. It's more of a, thinking aloud. It's not all shaped up yet. The evidence are yet to be put together, but I will try to skip through all the purposes and concerns. Can this be seen? I'm not sure. Is there a highlighter here? Okay, what you see on, there is a line between data, information, and knowledge, which Anir actually did mention about few things in that area. And there is the production process up in the left corner. The technology is nobody can see it, right? What you have in that figure is up on the left corner is an array of technology that defines ways of doing things, which define the real life. And data actually captures real life, which is transformed into information. that fits into the knowledge base. And out of knowledge base, you have new ideas to change the real life. So you have ideas that you try to implement, design, and then try to change the real life. That's broadly the thing. There is a feedback mechanism to develop those ideas. Now, at each level of data, information, you have the particular digital technology. Digital technology being referred to is IoT we talk about. We talk about AI, machine language, NLP, blockchains, all those things that go into processing and storing for special use. Then you have the IoT for storing and analysis. The bottom part you see is the area of digital technologies, which also includes AI for analysis. And you also have the robot part, which is the robotic technology that comes in the top. Now, these are the digital technology, and you make use of those technologies, and you consider digitalization is when you introduce these digital technologies in getting certain things done in a more efficient way that would create economic value. Here, what is important to note is that whole process of knowledge building and idea development can remain outside the system, and you can go on digitalizing with imported, borrowed ideas as well as borrowed digital technologies. And this can go on. And what is happening in many developing countries in the name of digitalization is exactly that, being without, minus the right-hand part where knowledge and idea feed back into your local system. I can give many examples, which I'll not get into now, but essentially, when I'm saying that unless you have a digital transformation strategy, so digital transformation is being defined once you include that knowledge building that allows idea and having a feedback mechanism to your real life situation in the sphere of production of goods and services. If you're not doing that, you end up into a consumer society which gets good things, gets good services in a more efficient manner, be it health area or be it some other areas. And you also are the pool of labor force supplying to the global market. Now, the trends suggest that that pool of labor force where you're constantly putting money to develop their skills will soon get redundant because the technology is moving fast. And therefore, keeping pace with that complementary skill requirement will be costly for any developing country. It will also be costly to stick to the old technologies. You'll have to abandon, you'll have to go for new technologies as you move from 5G to 6G, or as you move from certain application of devices to a further renewed applications of devices. And there is this whole market of semiconductors and other things that are shaping the global governance, but I will not get into those things. This is broadly the scenario where I suggest that basically, if you want to have an effective, sustainable digitalization, you will have to have a digital transformation strategy, which actually is captured by those blue lines, meaning knowledge and ideas. It doesn't have to be at the end point. It can take place actually at each and every production activities, each and every process that we talk about. Even within the government, when you are talking about processes, they're also having a training, one-time training that Anit did mention of the process reengineering or process simplification part is not a sustained manner. There has to be a mechanism where constantly you do your own research, you do engage in creating new ideas, and you create new, if necessary, devices or products based on locally available devices. That's one part. And what is actually hindering, this is where I address a meso-level institution, which I think is very important to take note of, because as I mentioned, many of these government initiatives, even private initiatives being funded by outside agencies, because not all of them are self-sustainable business-wise, not even, I think, Prava. I mean, it'll take some time to actually go beyond break evens. And so it's important to understand within the global financial flows and how those are driven and how those lead to project formulations that are tied in with the kind of activities we engage in. This particular picture captures those things. And what is being suggested is, we all know that there is a compulsion for balance of payment, addressing balance of payment shortages, which often forces, I know Mosharraf Bhai was in the ERD for a while, would know that the compulsion and then somehow pressurizing other ministries to take loans or have projects that will allow disbursement of the loans and not keep it in the pipeline is genuine, which is the right corner you see. I mean, if you drop my picture from there, it should be the balance of payment pressure from the appropriate agencies. And that actually go into the taskmasters, normally the multilateral agencies I'm referring to, something that Stefan had briefly touched upon, I think. And there, what you get is, as like any other bankers, their compulsion is to disburse. And they don't care where you are spending the money. And if you take that, then the contract, the loan contract, generally, if anybody has looked into those things, a loan contract generally stipulates a number of issues. Procurement may be tied to a project. I mean, where from you procure, what kind of technology you procure. Even the consultancy services that you get, there are criteria set which automatically ensures that the ideas are even imported. Imported in the sense that you have to hire consultants of particular types, and fulfilling those things may not always be possible. Now, I have list of technology hard, technology soft, workforce advisory specialized, workforce advisory local, and we have materials local and materials imported. Materials imported cannot be avoided, but of all those tasks, an agency where you are locating a project has only limited choice. And if you remember, Stefan remarked on the HTPA buildings. And that's actually a prime example where the agency who is responsible at the bottom, I'm not referring to any names, but have a limited choice and the money, and automatically they have to be good experts on construction management, on getting the procurements at that level done, be it landfilling, be it raising buildings. For what purpose is unimportant. There is a compulsion to disburse loans, and there is this choice of the institution, and the people in the institutions are kind of built in the whole loan arrangement, and the government's inability to assert itself to have a respectable contract. I can, since being a consultant, I have seen those things, and I'm not, this is something, a work in progress, as I said, but that particular contract has to be revisited. And unless we bring about change in there, we cannot actually proceed. When I'm saying we, it's actually a developing country case I'm presenting. So I'm not getting into the details anymore. If there is question at the end, we'll talk about it. The essential point is this is an old slide, I think. sorry. The essential point is a dependent mindset of it is better to procure than create has far-reaching adverse effects on a country's human resource development and its utilization in economic value creation out of knowledge and ideas. Leveraging digital transformation will be elusive unless disruptions are infused in a country's contract with the external agencies promoting digitalization and/or feasible win-win contracts are identified for a more dignified relation in the future. There is one option where we can remain in a good consumers market as well as supplier of labor, but we can also create gradually the knowledge base in terms of creating centers of excellence so that you negotiate directly bypassing Stephens and directly with the global tech industry and say, we will do it here. That's one kind of option. But again, going back to where are the entry points for any government in a developing country who is behind in terms of the technology, we cannot really suddenly change things. So we have to accept the fait accompli part and try to tinker around where the entry points can be. And this is why I'm saying that digital transformation strategy, the people in power ought to have a digital transformation strategy. We don't have one. And that strategy should spill out preferably by sectors and sequencing the importance of those sectors, how you enter there. Within the government, how you introduce the small changes of somewhere introducing IoT or other devices and creating products that will serve in making businesses and government service delivery more efficient. That's how I would put it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Thanks a lot. I think we have around 25 minutes for discussion and questions. I think we have two very interesting papers. One largely on the strategy development, the issues that need to be considered from a global governance perspective and also from the national perspective. And we also have kind of, what would happen if, when we are going for enforcement and what are the challenges and the issues that will come up and the way that, we need to sort of address that. And I'm pretty sure that, there will be a lot of discussion and a lot of questions on that. I think it's better if we sort of, take couple of questions and then allow each of the participants to sort of respond to them, their observations. So the floor is open and I will ask our respective participants if you have any questions, comments, observations. Please go ahead, and I think we have our volunteers there. They can reach out to you and you can ask your questions, observations, comments, anything. And I also understand that there can be some questions which will probably come from online because this is also on Zoom platform. So I'm requesting the organizers, if any such question arise, please share that with us, and we will read it out and have that. But for now the floor is open, and if anyone want to jump in with any question, observation, or anything, want to start. There's one hand over there. If you can just introduce yourself and then just name and organization you're representing, and then ask your question.
So I'm Maliha, and I work as a research associate at Brack Institute of Governance and Development. I really did not want to be the first person to ask any questions or make any remarks, but I felt that the two presentations very well went with what Stefan Durkon was saying in the morning, that there will be exclusivity and inclusivity, and we need to look into it. And then again, Professor Mushtaq Khan was saying the same thing, that we need to understand the context. before just going ahead and digitizing or importing foreign digital technology, as Sajjad Johid sir said. So that being said, I do have a question to Professor Mushtaq Khan. He explained a very simple looking diagram where we were defining violators and principles in terms of their compliance and their power. So my question is exactly how can we try to define this interplay of compliance and power and understand where a violator or a principal could also in times be a violator, would have high or low compliance or high or low power, and exactly what are the things to look out for. And also, often digitalization could be organic. We could come up with, the society could come up with organic solutions, perhaps not from social scientists, perhaps from engineers, people more into algorithms, more into coding and things like that. In that context, when we try to judge a solution or when we try to judge a technology, we don't really get to see what was happening before that right off the bat. We need to also see the impact that this potential solution could have. So what are the ways to look out for that? I think that will be my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I just want to sort of, kick off the discussion, and, I just want to sort of ask a few questions to sort of, I hope that will actually encourage the participants to talk about that. My question is also kind of, to Professor Khan and related with the framework. Whenever we're talking about the relative power of the violator, I'm guessing that, in case of relative power of the violator, it essentially has a relationship with the enforcer. So when the power of the violator is high, essentially it means that, he or she will be able to sort of, control the enforcer. Is that really the case? And if that is the case, I'm just wondering, because we know that there is that, you have also talked about the unprincipled principle, but also in the literature, there's also a term called principled agent, the agent who is actually principled. So what would happen if a violator had to deal with an enforcer who is that principled agent? How will that particular power dynamics will essentially play out, and whether, and how each of the quadrants will try to explain that. Along with that, I also want to encourage the participants to talk about the policy implications of that, because you have rightly pointed out that, before we go into that digital transformation or digital service delivery, we need to understand that what are the challenges are there with the analog thing that we have, and whether the digital thing is actually sort of, try to solve that. So in that perspective, is it possible to kind of have a hybrid solution kind of thing? There will be some analog, for this, lack of a better word, which will be complemented by digital things, and that will maybe a better option instead of just going for full analog or full digital. So this, the policy implication of this particular, research in terms of implementation, I wonder whether there are any other questions or observations on that. Going back to the floor. I can see a hand.
This is Faisal. I work for Al Jazeera. I have a question to Professor Mushtaq Khan. Like, do you have any quantitative data? I know you have extensively worked on corruption. Like, do you have any quantitative data that digitization has reduced this much corruption in Bangladesh or this percentage? I'm looking for some quantitative data. That's it.
I think there was another hand over there.
Okay, thank you. I am Zubair. I work as manager MIS in BRAC International. I have interest in research, that's why I came here. So my question is to Dr. Mushtaq sir, I think. Yeah. So sir, that regarding the digital transformation, what happens that due to frequent change of technology, like from IR 3 to 4 to IR 5, then or the digital transformation, the pattern of crime or the pattern of governance is changing, the demand for change in governance. But the problem is that I mean, the rapidity or the speed with which the digital transformation takes place, the governance or the policy making is not as fast as required. So how can we address that?
Okay, I think we have a couple of questions. More than a couple of questions. I think we can start the discussion. We can. I will, request Professor Khan to respond that, and if the floor come up with any more questions, we can address that later.
Thanks. I think there were some really good questions. I was also hoping for questions of clarification. So don't be shy to ask, I haven't understood this. Can you explain this better? That would be also fine. But the questions that were asked were really deep. I'm going to try and give a short introduction to what might be a conversation that we need to continue. So I think the first question was about how, we identify the power and compliance of different actors. And the answer is through a process analysis, right? Because we are not starting with a blank sheet. There is history. So let's look at how these things have worked in Bangladesh in the past in the pre-digital space, right? So what are the issues in land administration, in getting licenses, in getting bank issues clarified? What actually happens? And once you look at that, you can map the power, capabilities, and interests of the actors in terms of how outcomes have been achieved. So what do I mean by that? I mean, look at how the land mutation process works, how the land administration process works. There is quite a lot of literature and understanding, and also most of us have some personal experience of how this works, because most of us have some land which we have had to deal with at some point. So if you know this as a lived experience, you will not think that e-mutation is a good strategy. Because actually what e-mutation is doing is simply, I'm filling in the form online, and that's it. The form is, but this is not digitalization. Digitalization is that there has to be some seamless interface between my ID, my land's identity, and the transaction, whether it is registration or sale or inheritance or whatever. This cannot happen in Bangladesh because actually the land records are seriously deficient. There are contradictions inside the land records. There is a contradiction between the last cadastral survey, how the land was inherited and subdivided between people. Many of these subdivisions are not clear-cut. The inheritance has not been fully finalized. The demarcations have not happened. The demarcation with forest land is unclear. The demarcation with the khas land is unclear. The demarcation between brothers and sisters is unclear. And most of it does not fit with the actual possession of the land. Now you are coming and saying, let's digitize this or digitalize this. What is going to happen is chaos. So the first mover will go in, the more powerful brother, the more powerful villager, the more powerful business, and they will say, look, I have a document. What they are not saying is that many other people have documents and who also have partial claims. So immediately you are going to, now we are already seeing some of this. So, and you can see why compliance is not happening. Now this connects to your question. What is a principal and what is an agent and what is their power? So this is a much longer conversation. We have a paper on this, which has just come out. It's a working paper, which I can, it's called Making Anti-Corruption Real. And in that paper, we discuss this whole issue of principals and agents as a network problem. The way in which we normally think of principal and agent in economics is there is one principal and one agent. The principal is supposed to enforce a rule. The agent is hiding some information. And the principal either, so in that context, if the principal has better information and a process for correction, better information means transparency, and better process is accountability, right? So if you have processes and you have information, then the rule will be enforced because the principal has a self-interest or some interest in enforcing the rule. Now, actually what happens is that principals and agents are not acting in isolation. The principal has many other relationships, and the agent also has many other relationships. So people are not ever acting in isolation. And those relationships we call the horizontal relationships of the principal and the agent. So if you think about kind of a rule of law situation where the principal always enforces, what is happening? It's not that the principal themselves are powerful or the principal themselves has the power to enforce, but the principal is embedded in a society where the principal is connected with other people who have the power and the capability to make sure that rules are enforced. So even if the principal is not powerful, the principal can call on support from lots of other people to enforce, right? So what makes the principal powerful in a rule of law society is that the principal gets support from lots of other people who want the rules to be enforced. Similarly, the agent might be personally very powerful, but if in a rule of law society, if an agent violates and gets away with it, they will lose all their horizontal networks because they will not want to transact with an agent who has violated rule, because the agents who are transacting with that agent don't want to transact with a rule violator. Let me give you a concrete example, okay? So what happens in a rule of law society when a company, might be a very powerful company, is detected as having not paid a tax, okay? The tax official might be a very weak person. The tax official is a very weak person in terms of their own personal power, but they have detected a violation by, let's say, Microsoft, okay? Now what happens? So in a rule of law society, the horizontal relationships of the principal and the agent are such that Microsoft is dealing with other actors who will not want to deal with Microsoft if they're violating contracts because they have complex contracts with Microsoft. Microsoft is doing billions of dollars worth of transactions in very complex contracts. And so those partners want to know that Microsoft will hold to its contracts. Microsoft will not violate contracts, right? So those agents who Microsoft has horizontal relationships with will not want Microsoft to violate. Similarly, the tax official who has detected a violation might be weak, but when they say Microsoft has to pay a fine, lots of other agencies and political organizations and so on will support that tax official because they don't want Microsoft to break a rule because the credibility of the system comes down, okay? So what makes the principal principled is that the tax official who is allowing Microsoft to escape will be removed by other horizontal actors who will say this tax official is not good because by letting Microsoft evade a fine, they are destroying our business, okay? So the tax official will be under horizontal pressure, Microsoft will be under horizontal pressure. We are only looking at the vertical enforcement from the principal and agent, and that's a mistake. What makes that vertical enforcement work is that both the principal and the agent in complex rule of law societies are under significant horizontal pressure to follow rules. So as soon as the violation is detected, it is enforced, and the individual power of the violator and the individual power of the enforcer doesn't matter that much. It matters a little bit, but it doesn't matter that much. Now, when you come to a developing society, those horizontal pressures are completely different, okay? So if you look at a developing society, when a big company violates a tax and the tax official has found that this has been violated, if the tax official tries to do too much, the tax official will come under horizontal pressure from politicians and other bureaucrats who are going to remove the tax official because they are trying to do their job. It's exactly the opposite, right? So the horizontal pressure in a weak rule of law society is the principal who is trying to be principled will be removed. Will be removed because that business is not under any horizontal pressure from other businesses to follow rules. Why? Because the number of businesses is very small. These businesses all know each other. They know the politicians and they know the bureaucrats. So they don't actually need a rule of law to transact with each other. So I'm a big business. You're a big business in Bangladesh. I know you are a thief and you know I am a thief. But I can still do business with you because I am not relying on contracts to do business with you. I am relying on the fact that if you violate my contract, I can find an informal way of putting pressure by paying the police or paying the judge or paying someone to make so much trouble for you that you will deliver what I want. So business in developing countries do not rely that much on the rule of law. They rely on informal enforcement. And so their horizontal network does not support rule enforcement. I think this is really important to understand that when we are talking about power, we are not really looking at the individual power of the principal or the agent, but of the networks in which they are embedded. Okay? So when we say powerful in land, the powerful person in the village level might be actually a poor person, but they are powerful because they're connected to a particular party, because they know certain people in the bureaucracy, and they know the naib and the AC land and so on. And they can get things done because they are powerful, because the network is powerful, and the AC land who is going to go against them will be removed or will be in trouble. So when we are talking about powerful, we don't mean look at the individual, look at the actor and try to figure out whether they are powerful or not. We are saying, look at the networks and how they're operating, which is slightly more complicated. So the answer to your question is a really very good question, because this is what we are trying to do in our research, is to look at how these network effects operate in enforcement or non-compliance. Then you design your system to be aware of this possible manipulation. And sometimes it's possible to find a solution. Sometimes there may be no solution. I mean, I don't want to give examples, because if you look at the ACE website, you will find that we have found solutions in many activities and areas, not necessarily to do with digitalization, but with increasing compliance. And to increase compliance, what you essentially have to do is to find a solution where some of these powerfully networked actors will want to have rule enforcement in their own interest. They will force enforcement because it is in their interest. Now, so don't think that in Bangladesh, everybody is violating rules. Everybody is not violating rules. Lots of people are following rules because they are in networks where rule violation is not possible. But a lot of other people are violating rules. So when we talk about corruption or rule violation, we are actually in very complex societies. I'll give you a very simple example. If you are catching a bus in Gulshan, why are you standing in a line? I have never seen anyone violating a queue in Gulshan. Dhaka Chaka or Gulshan Chaka or whatever, everybody stands in line. Why? Not because there is CCTV camera and enforcement by police. Because if you try to break the queue for Dhaka Chaka, the line people behind will pull you back. This is the horizontal pressure. The horizontal pressure is that the people standing in the line have similar power and capabilities. And so once one person tries to break the queue, the people behind will pull him back and say, "Bhai, kothay jacchen?" Right? But if you are in a remote area and the bus comes every 2 hours and you are standing in a queue, no one will stand in the queue. The powerful will try to get on the bus first and no one will pull them back. Why is that? Because at that point, the distribution of power is very adverse. The more powerful will get on the bus first, even if it is totally transparent. There is no asymmetric information here. It is pure asymmetric power. You will get on the bus first and other people will have to wait for 2 hours to get the next bus. So what we are trying to do is to find those opportunities where the self-interest of the actors will result in rule enforcement. We are trying to create checks and balances within the digitalized system so that one group of powerful will check another group of powerful to make sure the rule is enforced. If you can't do that, then digitalization will fail, everything will fail. The way forward in our kind of societies is to find checks and balances between the powerful. That's when rules are enforced. And I think there are such opportunities in the digital sphere, and we are looking for that. And where you find that, then it works. And again, let me repeat, powerful is not necessarily the prime minister. Powerful is who is the peers who are interacting at that level. They have to check each other. If they are checking each other, then there is a balance of power and then the rule will be enforced. If there is huge asymmetry, at that level of the people interacting, then you will not have rule enforcement. Whatever transparency, whatever digitalization, whatever anti-corruption commission you bring in, whatever judge you bring in, the rule will not be enforced. I hope this makes a bit of sense, but it's a very complex question, and we have a way of thinking this through. Thank you.
Mustaq, so as we get more digitalized, the likelihood of power getting asymmetric increases. Would you agree?
In some areas, yes. In some areas, no.
Which areas?
So for example, in those areas where the violations were initially being done by less networked people, by hiding information, that becomes more difficult. So for example, the identity fraud that was happening in many places where I am claiming a subsidy, but the person doesn't exist. I'm creating jobs, but the person doesn't exist, but I'm extracting a salary. Those become slightly more difficult. But you are right that in many other areas where the issue was of asymmetric power, we have to be very careful. But even there, we can design systems to build in as many checks and balances as possible. I am an optimist. So I think we have to try, because this digitalization cannot be stopped. We have to try to build in these checks and balances, but I agree with you that there are dangers.
Okay, we have 2 more minutes. Sorry, yeah, I know. That's what I was just saying. That we have 2 more minutes. So the final call for the floor. Oh, so there is, okay, I think that will be our last questions, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
So my question was directed towards Professor Mushtaq, but I've also like for both of you to weigh in on it. So I want to take off from that nice little neat diagram that you had up there, sir, on the violators and those who can't comply, particularly those who are less powerful. So I wanted to draw from that and just ask if there's any room for autonomy or self-governance when there is digitalization being enforced from a centralized location, say the seat of power, and if the violators, those being located in some remote part of the country or far away from the halls of power. So like, can digitalization from that perspective be understood as the encroachment of the state, like vis-a-vis a leviathan of sorts, or so is there any space left when digitalization is being implemented on such a big space where people can get some sort of relief from the state, or there's room for grassroots autonomy or self-governance?
A quick answer, but before that, I couldn't answer some questions that were asked before. There is no quantitative data on the effects of digitalization on corruption that I have seen. There are some case study type work that I think also Anir referred to earlier, but it's really a process analysis. There's not a general story because the effects of digitalization on different applications is very different. In some cases, corruption increases. In some cases, it comes down. So we have to be very careful to not look for a general story of whether digitalization helps or anti-corruption or not. And so the change of technology question, I think really Sajjad Bhai will answer. But let me get to your question about the Leviathan state and so on. It is not surprising that digitalization in developing countries has largely been pushed by authoritarian governments. I mean, if you look at the history of it, it's not surprising at all. So the big push for digitalization has come from societies where governments are trying to control citizens. There are many other drivers of digitalization. The nature of technology has changed. There are many market opportunities. We heard about all of the business opportunities that come from digital technologies. All of this is true. But the big driver of change coming from governments has been Leviathan. Now, your question is, how do we fight against that Leviathan? Is exactly through knowledge creation about the dangers. If civil society is aware of the potential dangers, if our media becomes more sophisticated, if researchers become more sophisticated, if we are all talking about how to create these checks and balances, I believe it will not be so easy for Leviathan to be Leviathan. Okay? And remember that the powerful also have their own fears. The person who is powerful today might not be powerful tomorrow. We have to use that fear. Because if you set up a system that excludes lots of people, it might be used to exclude you tomorrow, right? Now, this is something that I think the powerful in Bangladesh understand very well, which is why we are having some space to even have these conversations, right? We need to have that opportunity to make this really that actually it is my protection is also your protection. Now, this is the old understanding of a rule of law. Why do the powerful want a rule of law? Is because the rule of law also protects the powerful. So I think this is the way to proceed, is to show the interaction and interdependence of all these things. And we know that, you know, one particular political party set up RAB, and RAB is being used against that political party today. So there's a history of this in Bangladesh, and we need to make sure that our rulers understand that it's in their own interest to have some checks and balances. We will not get a full rule of law, but we can have some checks and balances. That is my hope.
Sorry. No. Just
quick observe. Now, basically, it's not a closed economy we are dealing with. So whatever we observe here partly captures the reaction to the outside world as well. That's something just to qualify Mustak's remark on RAB and everything else. Regarding the technology, generally it's believed that, you know, what you said, centralization is the natural progression to us. But there is this other part. Decentralization is feasible only when the speed increases. And the hope, like I was reading a China article on China, which suggested that with 6G introduced, the prospect of decentralization which is true. And in our countries, what Mustak said regarding the powers orientations and the demand for technology, that fits in well, but that also creates, you know, the slowness that you observe in what you saw in Anir's presentation from 100 different websites to one website is a dangerous trend also. I mean, in terms of efficiency, something that, you know, one has to look into.
Thank you. And of course, this is not the end of discussion. The discussion will continue as we are going to have our lunch. I have been told that the lunch has been served. And that's the end of the session. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thanks to the distinguished panelists to have their observations. Thank you.